You've been very busy. I imagine, with these two whopping lawsuits. I would love to ask you about the one that really talks about federal funding and about the National Institute of Health. Can you help us understand what some of the local impacts of cuts to funding could look like?
Absolutely. And actually today was a very busy day, which was it was three lawsuits in total. And the behind these lawsuits is the premise that you have an incredible amount of power as the President of the United States. The one thing you don't have the power to is ignore the Constitution or federal law. And so the funding cuts from the National Institute of Health, there is a specific grant with it, OHSU, for approximately $2.4 million that's being impacted. And then there's the potential of grants that ordinarily would have been funded that are now being delayed and drawn out. And that could impact more than $250 million of funding in this state to things that we all desperately know we need. So that's research on diabetes, research on HIV, research on cancer, really important things that are going on already in our state. And these grants are now in jeopardy because they're purposely delaying the implementation or the actual process to apply and get this money out the door.
I'd love to ask you now about the lawsuit in regards to the executive order requiring citizenship for voter registration. Um, when you came together with Washington to do this, what was your concern on the impact it would have on your constituents should this go into effect and we lose federal funding for not complying?
One of the things that we know in Oregon, right, is that we have always been a leader when it comes to our elections, whether it's vote by mail, voters' pamphlet statements, the integrity of our elections. We've had Republican secretaries of states and Democrat secretaries of states who have hailed the integrity of our elections. And the Constitution of the United States gives Congress the ability to regulate certain things. So, for instance, you think about your national election day. But when the Congress is silent, the states control on how you run elections. And so that's why you have primary dates at different locations throughout the country. In this case, they're trying to use an executive order to usurp Congress and the state's authority to set laws on how we run our elections. And that blatantly is unconstitutional. Specifically, when you think about us as individuals in our community, there were about 13,500 voters in Oregon that sat down, looked at a voter's pamphlet statement, scribbled the circle which of the individual that they believe would represent them best in government, cast that ballot, but it was postmarked before election day, but just happened to be received after the election day. And it was because of the mail. These are the ballots under Trump's order. Those voices would not be heard. It's just an attempt to have less voices be heard in our elections, especially when people have taken time out of their day, research candidates, and know who they want representing them in government.
Some might say, why is requiring proof of citizenship that big of a deal? Especially, we've had issues here with people being registered to vote, albeit not many cases, but some when they weren't supposed to be. What do you say in response to that?
The law is the law, and people are supposed to be citizens to be able to vote in our state and in our country. And we have safeguards in place. And when the safeguards were, there was a screw up at the Department of Motor Vehicles. But the thing is, we have safeguards in place to catch that. It was caught. And in fact, our office is currently investigating, and I think it's three individuals that may have violated a law, which is a felony here in this state. And so we have a system that A, safeguards on the front end. If something does happen, we catch it. And number three, we have people in place to make sure that people who do not follow the law are held accountable.
And the executive order, which requires proof of citizenship, you were mentioning that there's also a requirement regarding the postmarking, rather like those ballots would not have been counted. Can you explain that for viewers who wouldn't know that nitty-gritty?
Yeah, so the concept of postmark dating, and you'll hear that in different states. Republican states have this law, Democrat states have this law. And really what it is people who have sat down and filled their ballot out in a state like ours, which is all done through the mail. When you put it in the mailbox, if for some reason the mail doesn't deliver it on time, and you've submitted it 2 days before the election, if the postmark on your ballot is before the election, you get to count it. because you've taken that action before the election deadline. And so that's the law in Oregon. It's the law in Washington. It's the law in some Republican states. And if Trump's wishes were to go forward, again, about 13,500 people in the last election would have not had their voice be heard.
Mhm. Also, I know that right now you said there was three lawsuits that you filed. I read the NIH and the citizenship lawsuit. What was the other one?
Yeah, so there was the elections lawsuit, which we've talked about. There's the National Institute of Health funding lawsuit. And then the third lawsuit we filed was on how the Trump administration is trying to effectively and constructively shut down some of our smaller federal agencies. One specifically that funds our libraries here in the state, that goes through our state library and funds like programs that a lot of us as kids, when we went through elementary school, we didn't realize it, but there's money coming to the federal government to incentivize reading for elementary kids. And if you remember, there's a book called Battle of the Books. And some people might remember this, where it's teams of four individuals in each school that have read a certain amount of books and they quiz each other back and forth. But it's really a way to incentivize people to exercise that core educational foundation of reading.
How many lawsuits do you have at this point geared towards the Trump administration? I remember covering another one in regards to the layoffs. You did the press conference in Arizona. So that's four? Are there more that we're missing?
There are. It's a unique period in the history in the United States where during the first presidential administration, you had only had one lawsuit that had been filed against that first Trump administration at this point in time. Right now, we have more is 12 lawsuits that have been filed against the Trump administration and the actions that they have taken. What's very interesting about this, and I think is very important for people to know, is you've had Republican and Democratic judges consistently, even the United States Supreme Court, have ruled in favor and against the Trump administrations multiple times on these cases. And you have a president that is stress testing our Constitution, and these lawsuits are meant to make sure that the president upholds the rule of law, follows the law, follows the Constitution.
Do you think we're in a constitutional crisis?
I think what's going on right now is that the president is being incredibly aggressive in pushing the bounds of his constitutional authority and has overstepped on numerous occasions. And that is what having an independent judiciary is all about. And right now, we have had a judiciary, an independent judiciary, and despite the rhetoric that you hear, you have had Republican judges, Democratic judges consistently exercise that independence and rule against the president. And that is a foundational hallmark for an effective democracy. Once that starts to fail, or once you start having Congress that succumbs to the pressure of trying to influence the judiciary, that's when I think you start getting into a crisis.
And procedurally, when do we need to hear a response from the Trump administration?
So those will be coming shortly. Right now, we are not seeking what they would call temporary TRO or temporary restraining order. That would normally be something, especially in the elections lawsuit, that would happen immediately. And so those aren't going on. So these will take a little bit of time before you start seeing rulings come from the court.